thank you. That was such a marvelous experience, listening to you both. And it's so different, hearing your voices and seeing you so close up like that, and listening. And Nancy, you alarmed me terribly because you read the poems in a different order from the order that, and I don't know, and I am just being silly. So if I just start with this silly question in a way because I got this order. So I was really taken with the order that you sent the poems in, which began with growing apples, which is such a beautiful, tender, um, tiny event, but it's much bigger than its tininess, isn't it? And then the sequence that you sent ended with, and I think it is definitely my favorite poem, The Resurrection. And you said something, that it was light, and it just seems a marvelous poem, The Resurrection poem, and it's kind of glorious and impossible, but it comes true in a strange way as well. And I've never, right, so if I just stay with that for a moment, the sense, that the real physical sense of the mouth on the fish and then the gills sort of going in and out, it's so remarkable. And the ending feels transcendent. And so I wanted to say, and in fact you've said it already, and it's obvious from the poems, but that the poems, they are poems of transformation, and you've talked about transformation a lot in various different ways. But yeah, that the poems make us more human, and in fact the poems are the process of making us more human and about people being made more human. And I was interested in, and it was helpful talking about the tilt-a-whirl and setting that in context. And I'm talking too much now, but in the order in which you sent the poems, tilt-a-whirl and the snapshot preceded the absent,
The
the invisible
invisible mother.
mother,
Yeah.
and that felt quite significant as well. Anyway, would you talk about the oh no, it's probably not possible, but that movement from the apple seed to the resurrection, just maybe thinking about those two and how they, I don't know, that feels like a journey of hope. And Dorsia said how that the beautiful greenhood poem was a kind of poem of rejoicing on which to end, and that it certainly felt like that. But I think resurrection does feel like that too.
Well, it's really interesting because so Resurrection is one of those poems that kind of came out of a childhood memory. Um, how true it is, I don't know. I have a memory of I did grow up in Kansas. I grew up on there was a lake, and my brother and I used to go fishing, and I was terrified of catfish, something he knew. To me, they were like nightmares that we pulled up from the depths of the earth, and I was absolutely horrified and would not touch them. My brother, on the other hand, was terrified of night crawlers, of worms, which is the bait that we use to catch the catfish. So we had like an arrangement, an agreement. Um, he would dig, he would turn over the dirt in the morning, and I would take the night crawlers out and put them in the can. I would bait the hooks because I was not afraid of the worms. But then once we caught the catfish, he would take them off the hook and put them on the stringer so we could take them home to my mother, who would cook them for breakfast. Um, so we had this arrangement. He touched the catfish, I touched the worms, and that was our agreement because I was terrified of the catfish. So it was truly like this memory of him telling me that there's this dead catfish floating on the surface, and him convincing me to actually like put my mouth to it to try to bring it back to life is truly like both horrifying and remarkable. And like I said, I don't know how true this memory is. But at the same time, as horrible as it sounds like an older brother tricking his little sister into confronting her worst fear and doing the things she would hate to do the most. In fact, the way I see it, it isn't that at all. It was not that. It was actually in my brother's mind, I believe he thought I was magic and that I was capable of doing something extraordinary, that I could actually I had the power and the gift of bringing this dead thing back to life, and he believed in me, you know? And whether he actually believed in me or not doesn't matter. He transferred that belief. I believed in me. I believed I could do it. And
And it,
it's interesting how I've kind of carried that belief with me throughout my life. Here I am, this scrappy, person from Kansas, and I got myself into law school on scholarship, and I worked at a big LA law firm, and I produced television back in the day when women weren't doing that kind of thing. And I've always had this sense I can do it. And a lot of it comes down to that poem because my brother convinced me I could do it, and I embodied that belief. So, connecting it to the poem Growing Apples in the County Jail, well, of course, it's impossible to grow an apple tree out of a tiny seed that was probably dropped out of something that somebody ate and fell into a crack in a jail cell somewhere. But the men believed. And they made it happen. They manifested it, right? Um, and that's, I think, so much of our lives and so much of how we move through our lives is all about that. It's about what we envision that we are capable of, which really comes back to Mila's question, how can poetry change the world? Well, if we believe it, it can happen, right?
and the catfish, um, oh no, that's so interesting that that's a memory. No, and however, like who cares about true or untrue? In a very deep way, it's true, isn't it? What happened in that poem, but in a way, that's what now you do with language, so that you take the language that it's all around us, and you take words like the and then also more remote, and you're breathing life into them, and that fish is transformed in the poem, and that's what poems do, isn't it? And it's what the poet makes the poems do. um, Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. And so I'm just going to say this because I don't want to forget it. I want to come back to how to forget, because that felt like a really, like a very important moment in the poems as well. But I was thinking when you were talking, oh, that was a silly thing to say, that tilt-a-whirl and snapshot have got to do with the invisible mother, but they have in a way, because they're about women being invisible. Anyway, we'll come.
Oh, they absolutely are connected. Yeah, because it's women, it's about the gaze and yet not seeing women as people, as humans. They're just objects to prop up a baby, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Although that the absence is a really interesting concept as well, isn't it? And so the woman in that is an absence, and absences are quite powerful things too. But
Right.
we'll come, yeah. So oh no, thank you. That was so good. And Dorsia, so I think maybe I have very much oversimplified this story, but I felt in the arc of the poems that you read, and it was just such a gorgeous reading. Honestly, the reading was like those multicolored umbrellas floating above your head. It was like being one of those umbrellas listening. But the arc um, seemed to be, or felt to me, a journey from the horribleness, the awfulness of the hurricane, and then a journey, an uprooting into another country, um, and then the sort of glorious celebration at the end of Greenhood. But I wondered if you would talk about, so what the poet is supposed to write about a hurricane, um, oh, that's such like a sassy way of looking at something, and it's really saying, "Oh, blow! This hurricane is bigger than me." But I'm not going to be intimidated by it. And I'm not going to write about it in the way that anybody tells me I must write about it. And so you talked about resistance, or you certainly that you um, that's what you were encouraging us to think about. And it does feel like, well, they all feel like all of the poems we've heard tonight feel like poems of resistance. But anyway, Dorsia, would you talk about the hurricane and the sense of uprooting, and if that's okay?
Of course it is. Of course it is. I'll try to talk about all of your questions and get to them. For the first one, what the poet is supposed to write about a hurricane, that came really because when Hurricane Maria was first on the big Doppler screen, you see all these splotches of color, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And to an artist, the eye of an artist, it looks like a big abstract painting. You just see all these splotches of color. And I thought, well, if I didn't know that was a hurricane warning, it would actually look really attractive. It would look really beautiful. It could be like something on like a wall that you would admire. And so I thought, this would be a really interesting idea for a poem. And then it turned into also, if we're looking at poetry and as poetry going against what you're supposed to write, poetry as poets, we go against the conventions of rules all the time. Don't put a period there, don't capitalize this. So I thought, what would happen if I just went against the conventions of what a poem is supposed to be like about a hurricane? And from there, so many ideas just came forward in my mind. I definitely wanted, though, Hurricane Maria to be a journey for the readers, especially for those that were unaware of Hurricane Maria and its effects in the Caribbean, especially here in Puerto Rico. People are very unaware. When they come to the Puerto Rico, they think of, the beaches, they think of Bacardi rum, they think of, hanging out, as you can see in my photo, Old San Juan, Viejo San Juan. And I have to remind them that Hurricane Maria was a very devastating hurricane. And even though it was 7 years ago, there are still remnants that have affected Puerto Rico, and you can see the blue tarps on certain buildings that replace roofs. They were supposed to be temporary, but in many places they're still there. FEMA has been very lackluster in its response to giving certain places funding in Puerto Rico. And so I wanted people to see this journey and that it doesn't also just affect the citizens. It doesn't just affect the building. It affects also our mementos. I have a poem in the book, my grandmother's photo, the momentums that you lose from a natural disaster and that you can't get back. Also, as I read today, the bee. And I wanted to also show this tension that Puerto Rico has, because even though on paper it's considered a territory, it really is a colony in the sense that so many ways we have to ask for permission or wait for the US to give us aid when we're just waiting around saying, okay, when are you going to help us? So it's this kind of tension in the relationship that I wanted to also have in the book, and to give a little bit of a background to people that may not be familiar with that. So many people still don't understand the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, and they don't understand why Puerto Rico is in debt. A lot of that is because of this exacerbated relationship with, the tension with the United States.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh, no, thank you. That's really helpful. And you can sense that the hurricane is, oh, it's almost a metaphor for other things as well, isn't it? And I thought, well, what I thought doesn't matter, but I really valued and respected the way that the poem that you followed, what the poet is supposed to write, was the bee. And it felt very marvelous to be talking about this completely huge, overwhelming event, and then to come down to the bee. And for a moment, no, your heart lifts and you think, oh my, the bee survived. But actually, no, the bee doesn't survive. And there's
Yeah.
something so intense about zooming us in, that feels very, um, oh, that feels very beautiful.
Thank you, Lydia, because I think too, and I'll just say this really quickly, sometimes people don't really understand the true impact of natural disasters, that it's not just humans, it's not just buildings, that it's the insects, it's our food sources. When we have to think about our relationship with nature, trying to work with nature, not always fight against it, because it's not just us, that are affected. And I think sometimes people don't realize the lasting impact, that the widespread arms, that the overarching reaches. And I wanted to show that in that poem, The Bee.
Yeah, no, and yeah, and I think it's good for us to hear that. So just kind of elaborating on what you've just said. So the Q&A section is
Hmm.
talking about yet another, well, it's another consequence of a disaster, because I feel or I felt when I read that poem and heard you read it, that that the event, this kind of uncontrollable event, is threatening to silence you. And yeah, so we come back to resistance, I suppose, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And I just wanted to say with that poem, sometimes people don't really talk too about the emotional trauma that people, feel after a natural disaster. And then what happens right after that, when you do have to leave your homeland, not by choice. And so you have all these different factors which push people to leave their homes, migrate. And then when you get to a place like the United States, which we see in one of the poems that I read today, it's not this kumbaya, welcome society. It's, well, you will assimilate, you will adapt. This is what it's going to be like for you. And if you don't, well, then you can just go back home. But then what happens when you don't have a home? Many people in Puerto Rico lost their homes, people lost their employment, and then people lost their lives. So when they're leaving Puerto Rico, they're going, really forced, they're fleeing, to have a chance at a life. And I wanted that to come through in the book so that people can understand, perhaps have some compassion as well, if we think about it from a human perspective. But as we know, what's going on right now in so many pockets of the world, there is this push for people to leave. There's a lack of compassion in general for those that are considered marginalized people.
yeah, no, absolutely. So poetry is resistance, and it's sometimes you just, well, you were talking about the need to do something, and Nancy as well. And yes, writing poetry is a form of resistance for all kinds of reasons. For the reason that takes Nancy into the jail, I think. Yes, right. So, oh dear.
And even the last poem that I read, G is for greenhood, even though it's a happy poem,
Yes.
is resistance in saying, that part of resistance too is saying, I'm not going to be responsible today for, this. I'm going to be responsible for my own self, my own mental health, my own physical health. And if that means going out for a walk and just looking at the trees and thinking of the birds, then so be it. And then you can get back to, whatever it is that you feel as if you have to do at that moment. But I think part of resistance also is knowing when you need to take a rest, because so much is happening in the world, and it can be, very devastating on our mental and physical health.
And I think noticing, because the G is for greenhood, is a poem of noticing, isn't it? Well, all the poems that we've heard tonight are poems of noticing, but noticing that's a really important action, isn't it? What's going on in our world? Oh, right. So, and I'm not sure how much more time we've got, but I was arrested by becoming American, and so in a way, becoming American deals with the experience of being erased by a culture. And so that that kind of feeds into the woman who's erased from the photograph. And also the Ghost Talker poem, I mean, those women are erased, um, yes, by the the world in which they live, by the world that's misogynistic very often. Yes. No, there's so much to talk about. So, Miller, are we okay for time, or should we be?
Well, actually, we're nearing the end, so maybe I'm not sure if you have like a short question for both poets to sort of
Yes, yes, right. So, well, I was going to ask Nancy, and perhaps I don't know whether it's something that you can answer short, but for both of you, but it's the impulse. What's the impulse when you sit down, like today, because you're probably earlier on in the day than we are, when you sit down maybe to make some notes for a poem, or what is the impulse that drives you to oh, I could give you lots of answers, because I could say it's holding that beautiful fish memory, so that we can all have it.
You know, that is the million-dollar question right there, I think. What is the impulse? Because as writers, as poets, we're always in search of that triggering idea. And, it's so hard, I think, and Dorsia, maybe you can speak to this as well. When you sit down to the blank page and you don't have a triggering idea, and often when I teach, for example, in the jails, I'm coming into a workshop with men and women who maybe don't have a writing practice outside of that time we are going to spend together. And I'm giving them a writing prompt, like, here is a poem and or a suggestion or an idea that you can write from. And even so, I know how hard it is to have somebody say, okay, write, you know? And I tell them, just get your pen moving on the paper. If you
Yeah.
have to start by writing apple, 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 eventually something is going to come to you and you'll see where you go. And one of my mentors, Marvin Bell, used to always say to me, no good poetry without bad poems, Nancy. Give yourself permission to just write the bad poems. But one of the things that I do, because impulses and ideas and poems come to you when you're not writing, mostly, is I try to make a practice of always writing that stuff down when it comes to me. When I notice something, I mean, I think it's interesting because you had just mentioned this to Dorsia, that her last poem that she read is really a poem of noticing and paying attention. And I think a poet's first responsibility or first job is to pay attention, is to notice the world around us, because most people go through their days without paying attention and noticing things around us. And, you know, that's your material right there. So, but at the same time, there's so much sensory stimulus in our lives. You can't notice it all. You can't pay attention to it all. And so I truly believe that the things that we see, that we do notice, that's our brain's way of saying, hey, pay attention to that, because that matters in some way. And when a memory surfaces, same thing. It's like, why out of everything that has happened in your life did your mind hold on to that one glimmer of memory? It must have some significance, right? So I write all that stuff down and I keep it in the back of my notebooks. I call it my glimmer list, and I just write it down at the very last page of a notebook, whatever notebook I'm working out of. And that way, when I do sit down to write, I don't have to write on a blank page. I can turn to that glimmer list that I keep in the back of my notebook and I can see what's on it. And it can be, just weird, disparate things like, an encounter I had with a man at the DMV, or, the other day, my granddaughter said she missed me so much. She had a bug in her heart. Well, I'm going to get a poem out of that, right? Um, so I think that as we move through our lives, we just have to pay attention and track those things that we're noticing, and that becomes the material for our poems. And then when you run out of those ideas, again, a lot of my stuff comes out of news articles. Well, used to, before I stopped reading the news, but I
Oh,
still
thank,
looking section.
oh, well, who knows what will come out of that? No, thank you. That was lovely. Oh,
Sorry, I went on.
no,
Okay,
no.
I'm just gonna try to say for 1 minute because I see the list for open mic. I would also say that I tell my students, think of the words of Nikki Giovanni, Audre Lorde, think of all of them that always say, everybody has a story. And who else is going to tell your story but you? Because if someone else tells your story, then they're going to tell it in a different way. Don't be a victim of the danger of the single story, which is what Ngozi always says as well. So think of your story, put it on paper, don't self-edit, just put it on paper and then come back to it. So that's what motivates me. I always think there's always a story to tell that somebody hasn't heard, or you can say the story in a different way. Just put it on paper, just get it out. You'll edit later. And that's what helps me. I'm just motivated every day, like, oh, there's a story. You know, sometimes it's something that you'll read, sometimes something that you'll hear, sometimes it's even something that you'll, as you mentioned, observed. And I keep a list on my phone of just random things. My phone is like my little computer, my typewriter, and I'll just keep a list. And then I'll come back to it at the end of the day and I'll say, there's a poem right there. And a lot of it will just, you know, come, I say, in an organic matter. It doesn't feel forced. And I think those are my best poems. Normally, when I feel like I have to write about something, I'm forced to write about it, those are the poems that I'm really struggling with. But if it comes in an organic matter, then I feel as if, wow, it's just the poem then literally writes itself on paper. I feel like I'm just the vessel and everything is just coming out the way it's supposed to come out.
Oh, thank you. That's really heartening what both of you have said. Thank you. Thank you.